60 days. That was the deadline. 60 days to defeat an entire continent. This was the core promise of Operation Barbarossa. Not just victory, but a victory so fast, so complete, that logistical reality could not catch up. In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht was a perfectly honed spear. They had the speed, the shock, and the belief. But history is rarely won by the spear. It is won and lost by the shaft, by what supports the strike. For every ton of fuel consumed on the Eastern Front, 3 more tons were needed just to get it there. This wasn't a war of armies, it was a war of railway gauges and grease. This is the visual lesson we ignore. Barbarossa did not fail because of the Russian winter. It failed long before the first snowflake fell. It failed in the planning office, where logistics were treated as an afterthought, as a predictable, mundane detail. Today, we are not looking at the battles of Smolensk or Kiev. We are examining the unforgivable mistakes of the planners, the rail gap, the fuel crisis, and the fatal reliance on a 6-week timetable. The planners' first and most arrogant mistake was simple. They built their entire war on the idea that the Soviet Union was just a wider, colder extension of Poland. They were wrong. The infrastructure itself rejected the Wehrmacht. Western Europe runs on a standard gauge railway track. But Russia? Russia runs on a broad gauge. This difference, just 3.3 inches of iron, created the strategic bottleneck that would ultimately strangle the invasion. Every single supply train had to stop at the border. Every single one. The Germans had to physically offload every barrel, every box of ammunition, and every tin of rations from their narrow-gauge trains and reload them onto Soviet broad-gauge trains, or perform the time-consuming and labour-intensive task of re-gauging the entire track itself. This bottleneck wasn't a minor delay, it was a calculus of exponential failure. Every mile the Wehrmacht advanced, the logistical trail behind them grew thinner, slower and more chaotic. If the railways were the neck of the invasion, then fuel was the blood. The core German strategy was Blitzkrieg, a mechanized spear thrust. But Blitzkrieg runs on gasoline and diesel, and the German High Command had fundamentally miscalculated their needs. Their plan assumed they would capture Soviet fuel depots intact, essentially forcing the enemy to fuel their invasion. This assumption, this almost childish confidence, meant the entire fuel supply chain was built on a wish, not a plan. The result was a disastrous logistical paradox. The spearhead, the panzers, moved by fuel. But the support, the supplies needed to maintain that spearhead, were largely moved by horse and cart. By late August, the German army was relying on over 600,000 horses, a greater reliance on animal transport than in World War I. This wasn't a modern mechanized army. This was a 19th century logistics train trying to keep up with 20th century warfare. And then came the Russian Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The roads simply ceased to exist. They dissolved into impassable trenches of deep, sticky mire. The horse-drawn carts, the very backup they relied upon, were rendered useless. The mechanized columns became motionless iron statues. The time needed to move 1 ton of supplies across 100 miles in September 1941 quadrupled. The Wehrmacht was starving its own cutting edge. Without fuel, the tanks could not maneuver. Without ammunition, the artillery fell silent. Without winter clothing or food, the soldier could not fight. The illusion of speed had reached its logical, catastrophic conclusion. The Wehrmacht had defeated the Red Army in the field time and time again, but they had not defeated the distance, nor had they defeated their own planning charts. By late summer, the generals finally saw the truth. Their goal, Moscow, was rapidly receding from logistical reach. This was the moment of the first great strategic blunder born from logistical desperation. Hitler's decision to shift the main objective away from the capital, Moscow, and south towards the industrial heartlands of Ukraine. This decision was militarily catastrophic. It forced Army Group Center to divert its vital panzer divisions, the motorized blood of the Blitzkrieg, hundreds of miles south for the battles of Kyiv. The panzers, already exhausted by fuel shortages and mechanical failure, were now forced to make unnecessary detours. The strategic cost was immense. Precious time was wasted. The autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, were closing in, and the chance to seize Moscow while the Soviet command was still fractured was lost forever. This diversion did not secure a new victory. It guaranteed the failure of the initial, decisive one. Even as German armies finally turned their attention back to Moscow in October, the fate was sealed. The logistical tail, having collapsed and been forced into a massive, needless detour, could no longer support the final push. The troops arriving on the outskirts of the Soviet capital were not the sharp, well-fed Blitzkrieg divisions of June. They were exhausted, frozen, and starved of fuel and ammunition. This was the climax of the logistical failure. The German soldier finally met the Russian winter, but he met it stripped of his modern advantages, sacrificed at the altar of flawed planning. The ultimate lesson is not about Moscow. It is about the subtle relationship between grand strategy and the grim realities of supply. In the next chapter, we will look beyond the war and draw contemporary powerful lessons from this logistical collapse. The logistical strangulation forced a fatal choice. With supply lines barely holding the front, the high command was paralyzed. This desperation led to the ultimate strategic blunder: Hitler's decision to shift the primary objective away from Moscow. The goal shifted south towards Ukraine's resources, bleeding the Army Group Center of its vital motorized punch. This wasn't a strategic refinement. It was a desperate, panicked detour that devoured precious time, the one resource Barbarossa could not afford to lose. When the armies finally turned back to Moscow in October, the chance for a decisive blow was gone. The logistical tail, broken by the unnecessary detour, could no longer support the final attack. The soldiers who reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital were exhausted, starved of fuel, and lacking basic winter supplies. The spear had snapped. The German soldier finally met the Russian winter, but he met it stripped of his modern advantages, a sacrifice to flawed planning. The story of Barbarossa is a cautionary tale, but its lessons resonate far beyond the battlefields of 1941. The tragedy of Operation Barbarossa is a universal lesson in organizational failure. The first lesson is the deadly cost of wishful thinking. The German High Command didn't plan to supply the Eastern Front. They merely wished the Soviet depots would fall intact. In modern business, this translates to neglecting the ugly details of delivery. We often focus on the grand product launch or the big strategic win, but neglect the boring, foundational railway gauges, the slow, difficult processes that actually get the job done. If your success depends entirely on what you hope will happen, you are already planning for a failure. The second, and perhaps most quoted lesson from military history, is that amateurs talk tactics while professionals study logistics. The Wehrmacht had the best tactics, the best tanks, and the best combat soldiers, but they were defeated by capacity. You can have the best plan in the world, but if your supply chain can only handle 50% of the requirement, your plan will fail 50% of the way through. This is crucial for modern supply chain management and project execution. Capacity determines ceiling. If your operational capacity is compromised by a 3.3-inch technical flaw, the entire enterprise is compromised. The third lesson is about disrespecting reality, specifically disrespecting geography. The Wehrmacht failed to understand the scale of Russian distances and the environmental hostility of the Rasputitsa. They tried to impose a Western European operational tempo onto a land that physically rejected it. In any new market entry or military campaign, the first question is not, "What is our plan?" but "What are the immutable, non-negotiable realities of the environment?" Whether it's logistics in Afghanistan or launching a business in a region with poor infrastructure, the geography, the culture, and the local conditions are the real enemy, often long before the competition appears. Finally, we return to the decision to divert the attack south. This highlights the tyranny of the initial decision. The German leadership, facing a crisis caused by poor logistics, made a decision that only compounded the logistical problem, burning scarce fuel for an unnecessary detour. This is a critical lesson in modern crisis management. When your system begins to fail, your priority must be to stabilize the core, not to change the objective. The failure to pivot back to logistical stability guaranteed the strategic defeat. The ruins of Operation Barbarossa teach us that every grand strategy, every ambitious plan, rests on a fragile foundation of nuts, bolts, fuel, and rail gauges. This is where the world's great power plays are won and lost. If you found value in dissecting the strategic failure of the century, this is the place for you. We analyze the past so we can better understand the decisions of the future. Subscribe to Visual Lessons of Defeat for more deep dive analysis into the moments when great power lost its way. Thank you for watching.